Predicting the future of global food supplies is more art than it is science. Of all the big environmental issues, the provisioning of food has to be one of the most complex problems we face. Food is personal, it's cultural, it's religious, it reflects our aspirations or our desires or our income levels. It's wrapped up in so much of what it means to be a human being. And so the production of food and the types of food we consume depend a lot on other parts of society, and they depend a lot on these external factors in the environment that influence how much we can grow. So in this video, we're going to look at a report from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization that tries to make some predictions about what the next 30 years or so of food supply is going to look like. So let's jump in and we'll walk through this report. In this video, we'll explore how inequalities, both within and between nations, influence food consumption and the global food system. We'll then look at constraints on food production, including factors like land availability, irrigated land area, and other factors, and how these may change in the future. Lastly, we'll walk through 3 future scenarios prepared by the UN FAO and examine what these might mean for society as we look toward feeding the population in 2050. I wouldn't normally start a video with a bunch of words on the screen like this, but I think in this case it's worth it. This video is based on a 224-page UN Food and Agriculture Administration report on what the food production pathways to 2050 might look like. At the end of this video, we'll look at these scenarios specifically, but there's some key take-home messages that run through the entire report. The first is that the food and agriculture systems that we depend on are and will increasingly be impacted by external factors and trends. These include population, consumption, and notably inequality in consumption, plus environmental factors like degradation of land systems, climate change, and resource scarcity. It's not just about growing food anymore, and maybe it never was. Throughout the report, the message is that agricultural practices and food consumption patterns must change. And if this change does not occur in a positive direction, then the alternative will be conflict, inequality, and ultimately the loss of productive agricultural lands on the planet. The path to sustainable change in our agricultural systems is not going to be easy, and the report makes this clear. Production must increase, but at the same time, resource use must decrease, and this means different ways of approaching food production and a more strategic overall global perspective on how we use the food systems we already have. Lastly, consumption is critical, and a change in consumption patterns from the trends of the past few decades is going to be very important to a sustainable future. At a global scale, increased equity, decreased waste, and shifts in what type of food we're going to be using is needed if we're going to find a sustainable path to the future. Starting first with the economic and social drivers of food production, we see a world where population, income, demographics, and inequality will drive future consumption. This is a point where actually many of the underlying trends that we've looked at in prior videos start coming together. Population is increasing, at least to 2050. After that, we're not so sure. More of the world's population is living in cities, and this trend will continue, and it has broad implications for the type of food that is consumed, and oftentimes, for the amount of food that's consumed. We see this in a graph of food demand by income group, which has changed steadily over the last few decades, and most dramatically in an increase in the consumption of animal products, which are some of the most environmentally intensive forms of food on the planet. On the upper left, we see a rise in food consumption, but also a rise in the other uses of food, which include things like biofuel production from grains or other activities that prevent those grains from going into the actual food supply. The graph on the upper right is a graph of income equality across countries. A value of 0 in this graph means perfect equality, and while the world is on the right trajectory overall, it remains a very unequal place today, and this impacts food consumption patterns within and across countries. Agriculture is also affected by technical and environmental drivers. Here again, we see many of the same types of patterns we've talked about in other videos. The upper left graph is a graph of water scarcity, and rising stress on freshwater supplies will restrict our ability to use irrigation in agriculture. The graph on the upper right, which is probably the hardest to read, shows the increase in yields over the past few decades, with the most recent decade shown in yellow. We've been very fortunate that yields across multiple crops have increased dramatically in recent decades, But as we'll see in a moment, this is only part of the solution for rising demand for food, and questions remain about whether these yield increases can persist. On the bottom left, we see the use of land around the world, and the large increase in cropland and rangeland from the 1950s to the present. Land conversion likely will remain part of the agricultural story in the coming decades, but this too becomes very complicated when we look at the world. The lower right-hand graph is the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture plus land use change and forestry, and as we can see here, these are major contributors to the emission of greenhouse gases, and agriculture itself and food production is already being impacted by climate change. And so the future will depend a lot on what these trends look like. As I said at the start of this video, predicting the future is more art than science. For many international organizations, these predictions take the form of narratives, describing alternative visions for the future of the planet. The FAO in this report uses 3 scenarios, and they describe 3 different visions for the future of food production. The TSS, or Towards Sustainability scenarios, assumes there will be economic growth that is global, but it will be faster in the poorer nations. In this scenario, the world invests in new technologies that support the transition to more sustainable approaches to agriculture. The world also establishes climate policies, and poverty and income inequality is prioritized in global governance. The BAU, or business as usual scenario, has economic growth at a moderate level, but which is unequal across countries. International governance is not very effective in this scenario, and poverty and income inequality persist. While the use of renewable energy sources increase, fossil energy remains the dominant energy source for the next 2 decades. In the SSS scenario, or stratified societies, the wealthy countries grow the most and conflicts over natural resources, including food, increase. International governance is weaker and income inequality is greater. In this scenario, the world does not place much emphasis on sustainability. These 3 scenarios are used to project futures where the different drivers of agriculture respond to these overarching trends. The project then is to look at the effects across the food production system. So let's look and see what some of those projections are. Some of the key issues involved in a more sustainable future for agriculture will be shifting consumption and waste patterns. The figure on the left shows caloric consumption from different products for the 3 different scenarios. In the upper panels, we see the high-income countries, and in the more sustainable middle scenario, total consumption of calories declines toward 2050, but it still remains over 3,000 calories per day. If you look closely at this graph, you'll see a decline in the consumption of calories from animal products. Consumption increases in calories in the lower and the middle income countries in all the scenarios as populations gain more equitable access to food. The figure on the right shows food losses, either at the point of consumption where most food is wasted in wealthy countries, or immediately after harvest where a lot of food is lost in developing economies. The most sustainable scenario, not surprisingly, has the lowest waste of food, for reasons I think are probably obvious to everyone. One of the very interesting conclusions from this report is the interaction between food prices and food insecurity. On the top graph, you see the projected price of agricultural production. And basically, this graph says that a more sustainable food system is going to mean somewhat higher food prices over the next couple decades. Part of the rationale here is that we don't really pay the true cost of food production at the moment, and we have to find a way to actually value food appropriately if we're going to see the best sort of global optimization of food production. The graph on the bottom shows undernourishment across these 3 scenarios, and you can see a very large range in the estimates of how many people will be facing hunger in the future, with as few as 300 million in the sustainable scenario and almost 1.2 billion in the stratified societies scenario. In terms of resource use, including land, we see several different possible futures. On the left graph, land use for agriculture continues to increase in the stratified societies and business as usual scenario, but more or less stabilizes in the more sustainable scenario shown in green. The shading in the upper part of the graph shows the estimated areas of land that would be lost due to urbanization, degradation, and climate change. These losses make the sustainable scenario much more viable in the long term, as they suggest that we're going to run out of some of the land that is currently used for agriculture. Irrigation requires some very interesting changes to increase sustainability. I'm only showing 2 of the panels for all the regions that are shown in the report around the world, but at the global level, irrigation must decline pretty significantly to make agriculture more sustainable by 2050. However, even in the sustainable scenario, it's notable that sub-Saharan Africa will require increased land area under irrigation. At present, only about 4 or 5% of agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa is irrigated, and this puts the continent's food production at great risk under a changing climate. So for a more sustainable future, irrigation has to be used much more strategically around the world to support crops in places where food demand is high. This graph is very complicated, but it's also worth taking some time to talk about and maybe pausing the video and working through on your own. The basic idea here is that all the solutions in the FAO report will require increased food production. There's just simply no other way to feed a growing population. The question is how you achieve this, and there are 3 basic ways. We can intensify agriculture on land that's already being used. And basically, this means getting more crop cycles or more crops onto that land each year. Just as a tangible example, that would mean, for example, switching land that is currently being cropped once a year to land that's being cropped twice a year. We can also increase the land area used in agriculture by clearing forests or other natural ecosystems. Or we can try to increase yields either through improvements in crops or through improvements in the inputs like fertilizers that are used to increase crop growth. I won't go through all the figures here because they are complicated, but the basic idea that the FAO has sketched out here is that different parts of the world will need different strategies to increase productivity. In some places like East Africa and the Pacific, the focus may need to be on yield increases. But in high-income countries, this graph suggests that the focus should be on the intensification of agriculture in existing areas. You can take some time and look through this graph in more detail, and I'd suggest you do, because it really highlights the strategy and complexity of what it will take to make our ag systems more sustainable. If we bring all of this back around to what agriculture might actually look like in a more sustainable future, we can imagine some very tangible changes. And in fact, the FAO report has a great list of examples that are shown on the left here. These types of approaches include low input or precision agriculture and improved technology use in agriculture. And these types of things are underway in many places. But the pace of innovation and development would have to increase to reach the goals of a more sustainable ag system. A couple other really interesting examples here of intensification are things like integrated crop and animal systems, including rice and fish, or crop and livestock. And there's great promise for these types of systems, especially in lower income settings where protein availability and nutrient availability are limited. So to summarize, what this report shows us is that inequalities in income, diet, and consumption are going to have complicated impacts on the global food system, and these are factors we have to consider as we look forward. We know climate will impact food production, and we also know that food production must become less impactful to help mitigate the risks of climate change. The big takeaway from this report are that the sustainable pathways for food supply in the future are going to require comprehensive systems change. That includes consumption, production, strategic intensification, and it also includes some hard decisions about where crops should be produced. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at this report. The link is at the beginning of the video. It is really worth a read.